All right, we're back with editor Q&A. Dan, go ahead and introduce yourself. How about that?
Randy, it's good to see you again. Obviously, you were out for a week. Good to have back on the show. Dan Pace, retired Green Beret and current author, sitting here today with Randy Surles, and we want to talk about to military and military interested authors about some of the challenges that we've encountered as writers and editors in this field, and see if we can kind of help share some best practices, maybe worst practices, maybe some pitfalls to avoid, and help people kind of get their stories together.
Yep, for sure. So Randy Surles, retired Ranger, Green Beret, editor, ghostwriter, book coach. Not an author yet, not really, but soon. I mean, unless you count the things like ghostwrite, but I don't count those. Yeah, so we've talked about nonfiction. We've talked about covers. We've talked about you guys talked about character last time, which
Hmm.
kind of bleeds over. And so I thought we'd talk about plot and how people can think about structure. A lot of people don't want. Sometimes they are offended when I say, "Hey, you're inside the incident, or this part of the book is in the wrong place," and they're like, "What do you mean? I don't want any formula. Formulas, that affects my creativity." But it's not really about being a formula. It's about flow, and it's about expectations of the reader. Does that make
No,
sense?
it does, man. And I'll be honest, like I am one of the people who, when you're like, well, here's kind of a formulaic approach, and I get immediately like, well, what the fuck? Why would I want to do a formulaic approach? That sounds like the opposite of what I would like to do as a storyteller. But the truth is, I mean, you're right. And as a beginning author, particularly, it's something we should all look at. Like, I mean, outlining a paper when you start writing a paper is a smart idea because it helps you get your thoughts coherently so that they flow from like the introduction to the supporting points to the conclusion, and you build toward an idea. And a story is no different. And so I think a lot of people can kind of not hamstring themselves, but let's say just start off on a difficult foot when you just start hemorrhaging out this story. You're just like, story go, and you just throw it out on the paper, and then you get kind of emotionally attached to the structure that it happens to have landed in. And that right there can really kind of tie you to a book that doesn't flow very well. And so having some kind of formula, having a way to look at, the story that you want to tell and then structure it, from the ground up can really save you a lot of time. Like I approached I approached the book that I was writing now more deliberately that way. And it helped a lot because it helps you know where the pieces of the story you want to tell need to plug in to make the story flow instead of having to reverse engineer it the other way, because we all get like a little attached to what we write. And as you write it and you start telling it, you're like, well, man, restructuring this is all going to be a real pain in the ass. And also, I like the way it is now. And you can save yourself that pain of like, murdering your own baby by just putting this up front. So I agree. I think it's a great topic, and I think it's well worth people looking at.
Yeah. So the big thing is the first thing I think people need to figure out is what genre, what type of book they're writing. Because every genre, whether it's a crime, a love story, a thriller, even nonfiction, they have different genres. With nonfiction, obviously, they
Mhm.
they have to meet the expectations of your reader, the people you want to talk to, and there's a reason why when you take all the thrillers and you kind of analyze them and on how they're presenting the events in the book, there's a pattern. And the
Mhm.
reason is because most people, when they want to read a thriller, they expect, hey, something's going to happen to the hero at the beginning that's going to cause him to go on a journey and find out who attacked him, or who attacked the world, or whatever. James Bond is solving world crimes, and Jack Reacher is solving more local crimes. But something has to happen in the beginning to get us, the reader, interested in the story, and the character, the protagonist, interested in the story. And then we watch in a thriller or an action book, we watch the protagonist, start investigating, trying to figure out what's going on, and eventually come face to face with the bad guy, and ideally overcome them if we're reading those kind of books. And then we can be pleasantly surprised about how that happened, and how it was over. Whether there was a complete victory or not, and is the bad guy in the next book? We can always, if he escapes, we always suspect that, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so there's expectations there. Like if you have a bad guy and a good guy all the way through the book, and they don't meet each other at the end, and it just ends with them like never finding each other, that's a very unsatisfying book. And some people, I've read books like that, and they're like, well, it's like the bad guy never met the good guy, and they never fought, or they never finished what they started. He's like, oh yeah, you're right. I was like, yeah, the whole point of the book, dude. And the same thing with the romance books, right? You have to have lovers meet, and you have to usually have some kind of form of a lovers breakup, because that's the tension that the book's going to have. And then they're going to get back together, or they're not at the end. And the breakup doesn't have to be like we broke up. It could be like I took a job overseas, or I'm in the military and I deployed and they're separated, and things like that. But there's different ways to apply that. But there is some kind of space between them at some point in the book, usually in the later part of the book especially. And they have to overcome that. And that's part of a love story.
No, I think it all makes good sense, especially as you start to like take that model and just analyze the stuff that you've read before, like throughout history. I mean, these are not, for the most part, new like tropes. Like these are really, really ancient. Like when you go read the story of Beowulf from, whenever the hell Dark Ages, Scandinavia that's written, you get basically the same model, right? Like here is this environment that you have it portrayed. Here is your main character. Initial event that kind of shakes him up and like, what's this problem? I got to solve it. He's got to go on the hero's journey to like, accumulate allies and find whatever the hell he's going to find, discover the true threat behind the threat, have a little victory, have a defeat. Oh no, we thought we defeated it, but it came back and now we got to go defeat it again. And that kind of story, whether it's a romance, because like your 3-part opera, your 3-part play that Shakespeare wrote, they all got the same kind of idea, right? I mean, or it's, it's a hero tale or whatever. There are echoes of it all the way down through history. And so I guess if you're going to deviate from that, to your point earlier about the protagonist and antagonist that never meet, if you're going to deviate from it, it's not like it could never work, but it's not the safe play for an author that maybe doesn't either have, the following or the skill to kind of pull that off. And so you see authors that kind of pull off that hard twist. Like Chuck Palahniuk was one of my favorites for a lot of years. I really love his stuff because, whoa, didn't see that coming. But unless you're that good and you can kind of lay it all out and still have a satisfying ending, even if it's completely not what you expected the satisfying end to be, you should probably at least understand the model from which you either, adhere to or deviate from, because if you're going to deviate from it, you still need to lead the reader along the path with the expectation that it's going to end so that your twist makes sense. Otherwise, you're just walking along blindly. You're like, that doesn't make sense. The expectation of the reader is what's going to drive them to the end of your story, whether or not you kind of go from the satisfying happy ending or this hard left, like what the hell kind of ending, like M. Night Shyamalan movie style. But all of that is predicated on the idea that you got to understand where you start, and where you start is these models, these stories, these templates that have been used for forever. So yeah, I think talking about them today is super useful. And Laura touched on them last week with kind of the character avatar thing, and it's a lot of what you're going to talk about. But you got to remember the protagonist, as she so like eloquently put it last night. She's like, that is the avatar of the reader in your book. And so as you unpack the world for him, you got to think about what you yourself are. How would you get pulled into this story? And I think to me, there's a lot of cautionary stuff about making sure you tell not too much of the world building, kind of like you talked about the other day with like world building, like don't world build too much, but don't build so little that I don't know where I'm looking at. Find that sweet spot and then kind of stick to one of these models. And I agree. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. So I made a believer out of you.
It's true though, right? I mean, it's because you're just describing what's reality. Like when you start describing it, you're describing like, actually, if you think about it, almost all stories flow one of these ways. And if your story doesn't, then it still probably at least recognizes one of these ways. You're like, okay, so we should understand that. We should make sure we get there as writers.
Yeah. And so everyone, I mean, everyone I know has always spoken about The Hero's Journey by Campbell, which is a kind of a dense book. But Christopher Vogler wrote a version of that called The Writer's Journey. So the hero's journey was used for a long time in plays and movies and things like that. In fact, I think George Lucas is famous for using the hero's journey and kind of verbatim to write the first Star Wars. Uh, what was that called? Something Hope.
A New Hope.
A New Hope, right? So,
Mhm.
but and he just kind of went down the story, and he's like, "What do I need here? What do I need here? What do I need here?" And he put all those people in there. So this is a good start for people who don't know about story structure and aren't sure about kind of the expectations of story. This is a good start. And it has, like, I think 15 different steps that you don't all have to be there, but of course the more that you have, the more kind of expectations are met by the reader. I personally learned from the story grid after I'd already read Vogler's. And that's what Shawn Coyne was an editor with like 30 years, and he developed this about 10 or 12 years ago. And he wrote this book, and it's kind of dense too, to tell you the truth. But they have a really good YouTube channel that breaks all these pieces down. And I got trained there as an editor, and then I still do contract work with them on their mentor program. That I think is really useful for writers. And then another famous one is the Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which originally was just Save the Cat. It was about writing plays and movies. And then Jessica Brody adapted it for books. And I think all of them any or all are probably a good read for a good starting place for writers. Save the Cat's actually really short. Only half the book is the theory, and then the other half of the book is examples.
Mhm.
So Story Grid's pretty dense. Vogler's The Writer's Journey is not so dense, but it's still a lot of theory with not a whole lot of examples. But you can see people using all of these on YouTube and see good examples. And Save the Cat's got their own program that you can pay for, where they have really good examples from current movies. StoryGrid's got some paid stuff where you can go to their mentor program and get mentored by a certified StoryGrid editor on their methodology. I don't think Christopher Vogler's got anything online. I haven't seen anything, but I made this, which is
Because you are a developmental editor, because
I
you are somebody people can come to if they need help structuring their book.
and I've read all three of them. So what I did is I looked at the different acts and kind of put the different pieces of each system into each act. So where it lies. So you can this will help people when they write their book. They're like, okay, this piece, which is described in whatever one or all of these books, goes in the first 25%, for instance, of the book of your book you're writing. So that, and this is all about pacing. Again, these belong where they belong because the reader expects them to be there. And if they happen too late, then the reader's lost. For instance, if you're writing a romance book, the lovers need to meet at the beginning of the book. If you write a book where the lovers meet in the last quarter or halfway through the book, it's no longer a love story because they never met, and the people who want to read a love story want to know all the ups and downs of the love story. And if half the book's not about that, they're very disappointed. Same thing for a thriller. If you don't have an exciting event at the beginning where people are in danger of dying and things like that, and you don't have anything exciting and no one even coming close to being killed or hurt in the first half of the book, the thriller reader is going to go, well, I don't like this book. Where's the James Bond skiing down the mountain shooting machine guns? Where's the the action? And so you have to kind of go through your book and sprinkle a little bit of what the reader expects throughout the book. That's why they picked up the book. So
No, it's true. I mean, I guess I think one of my favorite I guess love stories ever has been The Princess Bride, which is kind
Yeah.
of it's not really a true romance book, but it's a little action, a little adventure, fencing, sword fighting. It's got all the stuff, right? But one of the things I love about that is what you're talking about. They have to establish the characters up front. They have to establish who these characters are and why they care about each other. Otherwise, the rest of the book doesn't really make any sense, right? You're like, why is this random person who you obviously know to be Wesley relatively soon, why is he going to such great lengths to rescue Buttercup? Well, it wouldn't make sense unless you kind of understood this great magical love that they have for one another. And then all of the trials and tribulations make sense. But then the betrayal, right? When she hands him back over to save his life kind of after the fire swamp scene, that also makes sense because you're like, wait, this guy just did all of this, like structured his whole life. And you as the reader feel that sense of like, what the hell just happened? How did this happen? And then of course the ultimate triumph at the end, comes together well too. But that's pretty formulaic, and people like it. I like it. I like it even in spite of it being such a common formula. I still like it because it's just that good a story. And I think the style and the skill of the writer is really telling that same story that everybody knows in a way that is either novel or really, really engaging, to kind of pull them in spite of the fact that pretty much people know how it's going to end, right? You pretty solid guess, and yet it's still good, and that's part of the magic of it.
So the key words that we use in editing is it's surprising but inevitable. So your ending for your book, and also different people as you move through your book, what you expect to happen, like they're going to break up, they're going to get back together. Yeah, you expect that to happen in a love story, but how that happens and why that happens are the things you can change and make it different and make it intriguing and make it interesting. And so it's inevitable that they'll get back together, but it's surprising on how they did it and what they had to go through to get there. And so that's what these, I still hate to call them formulas, but that's what these kind of structures kind of say, hey, here's where the all is lost moment happens, where you never think they're going to get back together because he's broken her trust, or she thinks he's broken her trust, and there's no way for him to communicate with her, and they're never going to get back together. And so, but they're going to get back together, but you can't see it as the reader, which makes you want to read further. Like, how are they going to get back together? How are they going to overcome this? And then it's surprising but inevitable the way they do that.
How is James Bond going to escape the death machine? How is Wesley going to come back to life? He's dead, right? He's dead. How is this going to possibly play out? No, you're 100% right. I mean, that's the skill of the writer. I think it's worth noting too that I'm primarily nonfiction, but if you want to write narrative nonfiction, right? Because if you're writing a history book, I think it's a little different. I'm not an expert on writing history books, but I would imagine it's a more kind of just descriptive process where you're kind of flowing through a timeline. But if you want to write narrative nonfiction, the reality is a lot of these same principles apply, like what you select and the order in which you put the things and the way you kind of build the reader up along the story to identify with, the character in it. It's got to kind of meet a few of these criteria if you want to pull the reader in and make them engaged, right? You want to tell that true story in such a way that is also engaging. And that's challenging. It has its own challenges, but it has a lot of the same structural requirements that fiction does.
But also, I mean, looking at what we just talked about, surprising but inevitable, that makes the best memoirs, the best nonfiction books that we've read are like, I know how this ends because it's part of history, and the guy wrote it, so he obviously survived. But as you go through the book, you're like, oh my God, he survived. Oh my God, he survived that. So that's the surprising, inevitably he's going to survive, but what is the impact of all the events on this person? I remember reading, I can't remember the name of it, the memoir about the chopper pilot who got caught during Black Hawk Down and was a prisoner.
Yeah. I don't remember his name, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, just everything he went through and everything that all the different negotiations that were falling through, and we were seeing it from his point of view, and he was being told stuff and it wasn't coming true, or it just made his life more miserable, or, and his legs were broken and he wasn't getting treatment and all this crazy stuff that was going on. And just like, how much more? And The Martian, even though The Martian's fiction, just the amount of things that go wrong with with him, and you're like, geez, is he really gonna live through this? I mean, what is going on?
So it's so true though, right? Because I mean, that's a way to characterize it that I hadn't heard. But if it's a memoir, then obviously the person lived, right? Because it's autobiographical. And so the person lives. And so it does remove one of the sources of dramatic tension that you would normally have as a writer to kind of draw the reader in. Like, oh man, is this guy going to make it? But you can still create these moments with like the IED or the Humvee rollover or the helicopter crash, whatever it is. You're like, this dude's going to die. How is this person not going to die? And then how is this story possibly going to continue if he dies? That doesn't make sense. A person who does this really well, and it's historical fiction, right? Historical fiction has a similar capability because again, what the history, like again, 300 Gates of Fire is one of my favorites, and Pressfield I think does this really, really well. But what happens at the end of Gates of Fire. Everyone knows how the Battle of Thermopylae ended if you're reading this book, and yet your protagonists, as you read through it, you're like, this guy ain't gonna make it, but he's telling it past tense like a story. He's telling it as though he was there from the very beginning. So 400 pages later, how the hell is this guy not dead? Everybody's dead at Thermopylae. And so that little friction point right there, it kind of draws you through the story of like, this guy's here. He's clearly not a shitbag. How did he make it? And it's similar to what you're talking about with the kind of narrative nonfiction story arc where so you just want to know, like, how did this get resolved in a way that looks so obviously like the dude is going to die? And that's a useful tool as a writer.
So for narrative nonfiction, for memoirs, there's two really good techniques. One is you want to put what Laura likes to call blood on the page. And that means you really got to look deep and talk about how things affected you. Okay. So yeah, we know you survived, but at what cost? And what's going on through your head and your emotions because of this, and how has it affected your life and changed you? Okay, that's one thing, and that should happen as the big story. Like you get through the major parts, and then at the end, what's changed in your life and how are you moving forward in your life because of these things. But also these other big events that happen. There's significant events that happen through your life, whether there's an ID, you lost a friend, things like that. How is that affecting immediately after these events as well? Now, on top of that, we know you survive, but we don't know everyone else.
That's right. That's right.
So, realistic relationships and making us understand. And I think Laura talked about this last time, making us understand, showing us how important these people are to your life and the bond that you have, and then showing them in these
You're cutting out just a touch. Like your volume, I don't know why, but it dipped for just a touch in the middle there. Right after you're talking about Laura and showing with characters.
Yeah. So showing these other secondary characters and showing how important they are to the main character, especially, and you've grown to love them too, especially if you give them, realistic traits like their humor and their dark humor in case of Soph. And then showing them these dangerous places where they're losing limbs, where they're getting really close to death, and we don't know how it's going to end, and we're worried about their health, just as the main character is, where they're dying, and we're going to their funerals. That's how you build the tension in your narrative, your memoirs, the narrative fiction, nonfiction.
No, I like that. I like that a lot, and I like the idea that part of the story, part of the plot that you're laying out, like one of the whole arcs that you're laying out in a lot of memoirs, is the impact on the protagonist that all these things have had. And the way you communicate that is, of course, sometimes with reflection, and sometimes just when you talk blood on the page, with just how the person reacts, right? Your reactions as the narrator in a memoir are going to change from the time you're just like a cherry ass private to a relatively seasoned person. And so as the reader experiences the decisions that you make, they'll see the first decisions when you're just like, oh my God, hair on fire, everything is terrible, I don't know what to do, to this kind of, ideally in the end, a little more calm and collected response to the same events, but described in a different way because, as the writer, you're trying to pull the reader into your head. So you're just like, everything's a mess too. I kind of got this. And the other characters in the book, I mean, again, Laura really characterized this last week well when she was talking about how you never add a character to a book unless that character, except I guess unless that character is designed to have a specific impact on the protagonist that will communicate something useful to the story. And nonfiction is a little more constrained that way, but it's still similar. Like I emphasize in my books the characters who will create the pieces of story you want. Like if you've got a kind of panicky dude who's really having a lot of trouble with handling the deployment, develop that character so he can go from like, cool guy like everybody else to like, oh my gosh, he's really kind of falling apart as he gets to the end of this deployment. And it's clearly very stressful on him. Now, if you weren't the person that experienced that, you can't write that about yourself. You can't say that, well, this is, but if you want to communicate that that's the way war impacts people, it's useful to bring in those other characters to show how they kind of fall apart, how the war kind of impacts them. Like I think Apocalypse Now, these are fiction, but Apocalypse Now, the things they carried, they both do a good job of bringing in those other characters and saying like, the hell, man, you take this baseline of human and you run them through this kind of list of experiences, you get a lot of divergent responses to that. And I think that's one of the most powerful plot drivers you can have in a narrative nonfiction book, is just the impact of the characters. Because a lot of times the setting can only be, I guess the events in the setting are pretty constrained, but what you do with the characters and what you show with the characters can really bring it to life. I think.
No, I agree. And I think, I guess a third tip I would say is, show versus tell, right? And instead of telling the reader, especially in memoir, people always go to telling, right? They want to tell all the stuff that's going on instead of showing a scene where a character's doing something. Instead of saying he's brave, show him doing something brave, right? Instead of telling us that he's loyal, show us through his dialogue and show us through his actions that he's loyal. Then he puts people above himself when he makes decisions. Like I think Laura might have spoken about this biography we wrote about a Medal of Honor awardee who had a ticket home in Korea. He spent 14 months in Korea and he had a ticket home, and he heard that his old unit was having trouble at Hill 200, wherever the hell that is. And basically, what a company's worth of people, which is 200, was reduced to less than a platoon. And they had 2 officers left. They had an E6 that was in charge. And he showed up. He's like, oh, those guys are in trouble. I guess I'll lead a supply train over there. So he leads a supply train. He goes to the head shed, and there's a I think I want to say it wasn't even a company. We're talking about a battalion. Like there was like 30 or 40 people left in the battalion, and there was like the XO, the lieutenant colonel who was the commander, and some other officers that weren't like infantry officers. And then this guy shows up, and they're like, I guess we're gonna make one more run at it. Who wants to lead them? And everyone's like, he's like, I guess, yeah, I got it. No problem. He didn't even have a gun. He already turned his gun in, and he goes up there. IMT.
Yeah.
He low crawls up, gets to the guys. They're all hunkered down. He's like, anyone got a gun? And they give him a rifle. He's like, follow me. And he just charges up the hill, and he catches grenades. He's throwing them. But these are like, you're just like, what is he doing? Like we wrote it so that he was checking out, and someone's like, hey, these guys are having trouble with Hill 200, Company G. And he's like, huh? And then, he's like, hey, who's in the next supply train? He's like, oh, we don't have anybody. And he's like, I got it. So he just starts, we showed him volunteering for these things. We showed him, the way it was originally written, it was like, meanwhile, over here, Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so was having a difficulty choosing who would go. That's all telling. But hey, this guy, Lloyd, aka Scooter, shows up with the supply train. He's like, hey, I got supplies for the troops. What's going on here? He's like, we're trying to figure out who's going to lead the next group. And then he looks around and sees them all battered and muddy and shit. He's like, I guess I'm up. And then, that's showing, right? As opposed to, and then volunteered, that's telling. So the impact of seeing that in writing, the reader putting himself in the scenario, the way Lloyd saw them and looked into each one of their faces and saw defeat, and then said, I'm in.
So that right there was one of my favorite pieces of feedback from our whole editing process for the first memoir, because I loved it. I mean, it was absolutely great the way you and Laura kind of were like, hey, let on the page and show it, don't tell it. Because I think a bad habit, a crutch people can easily lean on or fall into, depending on the metaphor you want to use, when you're doing a first person narrative, is to tell too much, because it's a first person account. And so if I'm telling a story, like I'm telling a story over a beer, I'm going to tell what happened. I'm going to tell the people what happened. We're going to kind of nod along. You're not going to act it out like you're in a play, because if you're telling a story, you're usually not going to do all the voices in the dialogue. And I mean, maybe some stories, but most stories you're just telling. And it can easily fall into that trap. And when you do that, you really start crossing the line into basically history. I mean, you read a lot of stuff. Like I think Magellan was the 82nd guy that wrote a book. I have it. It's pretty good. All the way to Berlin. But it's very exposition-y. Like he does show some things, but he tells a lot of things. And he's just like, hey man, I'm having a beer and I'm telling you this story. It's not nearly as engaging as when you pull the reader in and you allow that tension to build, because you're in the scene. You're describing like, this is how I'm very uncomfortable. I'm standing in this scenario. What's going to happen? Everybody that's been in a scenario can imagine the same things you're going through. Like, no, he's walking into this new office. He's super uncomfortable. Who are all these people? Look, this guy's muddy and dirty. Like, he's confused. And when you show that, it's totally different than walking in and just like, and then we did this, and then we did this, and we did this. It creates a level of engagement. Like, for example, a medevac scene. I did a medevac scene that had all of the radios going off and all of the dialogue, and it's a mess, and you don't even read about who's saying what. A lot of times it's just like, okay, here's the words coming into, but you're trying to create that confusion in the reader that you were experiencing yourself. And if you just try to describe that same medevac scene without having them live through that confusion, it's just weaker. It's less engaging. It doesn't mean you're not describing the same event accurately. It just means that you're not really pulling them in. And so I love that feedback, and I would definitely offer that to anybody writing a memoir. Is even if it means you have to kind of like stretch a little with, okay, I know what was said and I know what happened. Was the dialogue word for word correct? Probably not. My ability to regurgitate exact dialogue from 20 years ago is slim. You as a writer need to describe whether or not that is more important to you, to have the absolute word for word accuracy, or to get the idea across in a way that's engaging. And I would offer those are two ways to present nonfiction. Maybe some people would say that's not even nonfiction anymore, but maybe that's kind of what Tim O'Brien's talking about, where you're like, well, what the hell's the difference between fiction and nonfiction at a certain point? But that's an important thing you need to decide, because if you're going to go more toward the history side, it's going to be much drier, even if, and you're going to lose some of that engagement.
So, yeah, I think people should, give themselves grace to, I mean, even if I repeat a conversation that happened 5 minutes ago in my living room, I'm not going to get the words exactly right.
Right.
So, and then people think that when they put it on paper, they're saying that's exactly what happened. But that's why everyone pretty much puts a paragraph at the beginning of the book saying, hey, this is the best of my memory. And so the idea would be you get, for lack of a better word, the idea through to the reader, what happened, what's going on, at least from your perspective. It's your book, right? And so this is the way, even if these aren't the exact words, this is the situation as you saw it. And I guarantee you have 4 people in a room, they all remember exactly the different words.
I can guarantee, like every account, like I've gone through a pretty big list of people who were at all of the things that I'm writing about in all of the books, and you never get 4 identical stories. Sometimes you get straight up contradictory stories, and then you have to like bring in a third person for almost like arbitration. Like, what do you remember? Because man, I remember this, and this guy remembers that, and what was the truth of that? But we're all soda strawing in all these situations. You're only seeing your tiny little perspective of an overall huge situation, and so you got to just kind of write it out as best you can. And I love, I mean, I talk to Tim O'Brien a lot, but I love his quote where he said that something can be false and truer than anything ever written, and something else can be entirely true and completely full of shit. And that's a bad paraphrase. But what he's saying is you could regurgitate the details perfectly as you remember them. Let's assume you had an eidetic memory and you just absolutely hemorrhaged them. You might still miss the whole point of what was going on there. But conversely, you can tell the truth of what happened. You can capture the feelings behind it. You can capture the events. You can capture the scenario in a way that the reader will understand it. and fudge around some of the details to just make it kind of fit together in a way that makes sense. And I think that's just an important thing as a writer. You got to figure out, like, you want to tell, which are you trying to capture? Word for word truth, you maybe missed the point, or are you trying to capture the point at the expense of possibly some of the eaches? And that's tough balance.
That can be expanded out to the book too. And we can talk a little bit narrative, nonfiction, and fiction on this. Is like when people are writing fiction, Laura and I are like, "Why are you writing this book?" I just thought it was cool. I was like, "Yeah, but you could have wrote any book in the world, and this is the first book you wanted to write. Why is this important to you?" And inevitably, someone's going to tell us why it was like deep felt, why they wanted to write this. I wanted to write about how people get screwed over in the military, but not that the military's bad, but there's some bad people in the military that are selfish and don't think about themselves. And that's why I wanted to write this book about a female Jack Reacher who was getting screwed over and overlooked because the chain of command was too selfish to support the troops like they're supposed to. And that's why I'm writing this story. And I'm like, oh, well, let's look at that a little deeper, and figure out how we can bring that heartfelt things that you loved and hated about the military and apply it to what you're trying to do in this story. And the same thing goes for narrative nonfiction. Like, what are you trying to do with this narrative nonfiction story that you're writing? Because then if you can tell me that as your editor, then I can go through and go, okay, this isn't, can you see with clear eyes and full heart? Can you see how this doesn't really go in your book? Because that's not doing what you wanted this story to do. And I know it's an important story to you, and that doesn't mean you can't use it somewhere else in your writing life, whether it's a short story somewhere or another book where it's a flashback or something like that. But as a chapter in itself, supporting the concept that made you want to really write this book and the point of this book, this chapter as it's written definitely doesn't go in this book.
That's huge. And we're talking plot today, right? But one of the things you got to remember is what you're talking about, that the plot of even a nonfiction book is not necessarily just this objective thing that is out there in reality and you're just going to try and capture it. The plot of the book is going to be driven by the purpose behind why you wrote the book. Like the memoir I'm working on now, I really wanted to capture, okay, it's about Afghanistan 01 to 05. Okay, so if I'm looking at deployments to Afghanistan from 01 to 05, there's 100 plots you could write using that as your setting. You could talk about, where did the GWOT go and how did it start and how did it progress and what's it like? But I chose that the purpose I want to say is, hey, what's it like for the actual people fighting in a war? What's it like to be a private at war? You go off the street, you go through a little bit of training, and then all of a sudden you're in this world. You've gone from like college kid, guy who works at Wendy's to guy in combat. And how harsh a transition is that? And then what does combat do to that person and the people around him? Because in my view, like purpose-wise, I'm like, I want people to understand that experience so that they can understand what it's like to be a private in war, and they can understand why when you bump into somebody who's been to war, they seem maybe a little off. Like you as a reader, like, what's going on with this guy? Like, well, this is what it's like. This is that kind of harsh transition. I want people to get to experience that. But that's not necessary. It was not obligatory that be the purpose behind why I wrote the book. And then if I had chosen a different one, well, then to your point, the whole plot, everything would be different because you're going to choose different scenes. You're going to choose to emphasize different moments, and you're going to choose a whole different arc to build up behind this kind of reluctant person who ended up in the war. Like, I mean, if you were telling the Pat Tillman story, for example, you would tell it totally differently than I would tell the Dan Pace story because, hard charger, hardcore, tragic ending is a totally different, I gave up this career. I'm doing from slacker kind of shithead to like dribbles into the army almost accidentally to like, oh, what the hell? And somehow becomes, like an NCO in the infantry. Those two stories are totally different, but they take place at the same time in the same organization. And on the surface involve a lot of the same pieces. And so to your point, like what you select to tell should be driven by your purpose. And that is the whole difference in the two stories. And it's just important to remember that purpose is key.
Yeah. And so in fiction, your hero protagonist needs a goal. Like, what are they trying to accomplish? And there has to be different levels of this goal. It has to be a physical goal. As a reader, I have to know you've either reached the goal you set in the beginning or didn't reach, and that can look like, kill the villain. It can look like stop the nuclear war. It can look like save the damsel in distress. Those are like thriller ones, obviously. If it's a crime story, solve the mystery, solve the crime, and bring the villain to justice, right? And so you can see those on the paper, and those are the physical goals that they want to accomplish by the end of the book. And so every chapter is in pursuit of that. And if you have a chapter which doesn't either make him or her get closer or farther away from that goal, if it's just a chapter that just says a bunch of stuff, but they don't move closer or farther from that goal, maybe that chapter either something needs to be added to it to make it, important to the plot of the story, or it needs to be eliminated, and we need to move on, because it's not really, the reader's going to go, why are we here? What's going on? I don't see anything being solved in this chapter. So so that's what, and that's also going back to characters, right? If you have usually named characters, especially in the beginning of the book, the reader's like ears perk up, like, oh, this guy is probably important. And then if the waiter that's named, that had like 5 lines of conversation in there, like, oh, he's coming back, but then he doesn't, you're like, oh, that's why did we even talk about that guy?
It frustrated me. Like, you wasted my time. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so I've had books where there was like literally like over 100 named characters, sometimes with both first and last names. And you're like, no, man, don't do that. Especially and going, while we're on characters, I don't know if you guys talked about this last time, but some people want to start their first chapter with 12 characters in it. But you need it, and even in nonfiction, you need to figure out where your starting point is, where you're introducing the important characters to your book slowly. And some people want to start their memoir with a really exciting moment, like the IED or something like that, or when they get shot or when they crash or whatever, and that's fine. But think about where you want to cut it, so that you don't have to overwhelm the reader with 14 people's names in the beginning. Start with something that you can just show the main character going through something really hard, and maybe there's another character in there, maybe not, and then you cut it short. You just tease them with, we're reviewing a really great memoir right now about a helicopter pilot that lost his leg, and they start with that scene. But in my opinion, it's kind of long, because there's a lot of other people that get involved in that. All of a sudden, there's like 12 people involved, where we could have stopped it with, he looked down as he swam to the shore. He's like, I can't swim fast. Why am I swimming so slow? And he looked down, and like one of his legs was really mangled. And so I was like, that's the end, period. That's the hook. Like, I'm like, holy crap, did he even make it to shore? And who wrote this book? Did he write it or his daughter write it? And so that's the hook, right? Do we need to see him, fight the river, and someone else, right, swam after him, and all this other stuff? That's going to be in the whole book, right? We're going to go back to the beginning and tell the whole story. This is just a prologue. And so if you're going to hook the reader with the least a number of characters you can, so you're not overwhelming them, because they're going to try to remember all those guys. And when they see them in the story, it's going to give away some of the surprise as well, right? When did this crash happen? Because if you had a long career, we don't know when it happened. But when you start introducing the guys that you talked about in the prologue, I'm like, it's the Avengers assembly. They're all assembling.
Ultron's coming together.
So it's but it's really important to hook your reader too with that prologue as well. So because you're gonna write that in the Amazon description, the back of your book, all of your marketing will have kind of the hook, and so putting that in the beginning is like, yep, this is what I came for. I wanted to read how this guy survived this accident and overcame it.
No, you touched on 2 huge things to me there. Like, one is, the introduction and the removal of characters, right? Fiction, obviously, you can be even more deliberate about this, I think, and you have full control. With nonfiction, you have to balance it with, who you want to have basically get kind of a shout out in the book or a mention. You don't want to say that it was, let's say there's 3 different people. You don't want to roll those into one character if you feel like you'd be taking somebody away from the other person. So how do you help the reader do that? To me, the way I at least try to do it is as you sequentially do it, you can write the characters back out, right? So if you bring a character in and he's there for a phase because he's there for this deployment, he's PACS's, just kind of close the loop for the reader and like, why am I not hearing this guy's name anymore? Oh, add it in there. Throw it in as like, man, this guy left. He went to jail. He got a DUI and he got booted. I mean, in this story that I'm writing, at least that's a huge part of the Army. It's people are always cycling in and out. So you don't want to confuse the reader endlessly. You're like, who the hell is this? You said this guy, but you mean this guy. Like, make that part of the story and write them back out. I mean, again, George R. R. Martin does this great. He writes the characters right back out. Dude gets his head cut off. All right, well, I guess I'm going to emotionally detach from that dude. He does it way better than I'd ever hoped to. But the other thing I love that you talked about is how you want every piece of the story to build along the plot, right? It should support the reader's journey along whatever the story that you're telling is. And one of the things you can do that with in nonfiction or in a memoir, since I think probably a lot of our audience will go that way, is I picture the tone of the character involved, right? So if you picture Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit, he is clearly an unwilling hero, right? You have moments when he's like surging forward and extra brave, and they are always met like the story responds by beating him back down into the unwilling hero moment. He's like, what the hell was I thinking? Why did I do that? And so he gets dragged along, but there's no moment when he becomes the heroic know-it-all Gandalf style character. Never in the book does that happen. You can kind of dribble him along one way, but you have to remember that when you're writing too, if you want your character progression arc to follow, let's say the Bilbo Baggins arc of reluctant hero, carries himself very bravely all the way to the end in spite of himself almost, and comes home to kind of live happily ever after. Be conscious of that. Be conscious of the tone as you write. Be conscious of the things that you portray your character doing so that you're not out sequencing them. You don't want him to develop too fast and then he, kind of devolves back into his old self unless you're very deliberate about that. It should be kind of chronological and flow. Otherwise, again, it's confusing. You're like, wait, this guy was awesome a chapter ago. Why did he turn into a shitbag again? Unless you have a good reason to communicate that, you should make it nice and predictable because it will support the story that you're trying to tell. And you don't want to forget that. I sometimes add in extra scenes. Like, hey man, I wrote a scene. I'm in love with it. Sometimes you just got to chop that shit. You got to cut it. Like you said, you could bring it as a short story later. Sometimes you just have to delete it because it just doesn't work, even though you really want it to work. And that is one way you can determine if you're kind of on the right track with that is, hey, does it support this overall arc you're trying to build? Or is it really either superfluous or actually distracting? Because you don't want either of those.
I think all of what we've been saying kind of goes back to when you select an editor for your book. Just be prepared to, just be open-minded. The obviously the editor should have a good reason, and they should be able to articulate that reason. Like, hey, I don't think this scene you have here belongs in this book because of the following. And Laura and I are very specific about having a conversation before we even start editing with like, why are you writing this book? What's this book about? What's your goal with this book? And getting all that information so that's basically our fodder for when we say, hey, this chapter doesn't, one of these things doesn't, not like the others. And this is why. And then so many people are like, well, that's really important to me. I understand. And when I read it, I know it's important to you. I just don't think it's important to your readership for the book you're trying to write, which doesn't mean that it can't be part of your writing, encyclopedia that you're going to end your life with, and you can apply it to something else, whether it's a short story or it's a feeder story for the book, or it's some other book with a different lesson and a different goal. Maybe it goes in there. Or if you're writing fiction and you love this chapter, I love this chapter. I spent so much time in this chapter. It's really special to me. It's a great chapter. I just don't think it belongs in this book. That doesn't mean you can't write a prequel one day and put it in there. It doesn't mean you can't write another book where he has a flashback with this in it. But at the book I read, this piece right here doesn't really change anything, move it closer or farther from the goal. And it just doesn't belong in this book. That's all I'm saying. And then he'll try to salvage it. He'll go, what if I add this? What if I change that? Like,
I,
well, then it's a new chapter and I'll have to read it again. Once you do that, we'll figure it out. But, as it stands, it's just not something I would include in the book. And being open-minded to your editor, just listening to them, and you don't have to agree with them when they say it, but walk around with it in your head for a little bit, for a couple days, and come back and relook at it and say, they're kind of right. Most people have agreed with us in the end, but there's been a lot of tense moments where at the moment I mentioned it, they're like really emotional about it because it's theirs. They wrote it. They wrote it for a reason because it was important to them. And it's just not as important to the story as they want it to be, unfortunately.
well, it's important. Like an editing relationship is going to be like fraught with a little bit of friction. It would be a shitty editing relationship if there was no friction. Because if you're bringing on an editor, the reason you should absolutely have an editor. If anybody out there thinks you should just write your own stuff and just throw it out there and publish it with no pre-readers, no editors, nobody to give you any feedback, I would argue that you're probably off on the wrong foot, right? I mean, an editor is someone who basically you are paying to give you objective perspective on what you're looking at. And now you can even cheat a little on this. You are pre-gaming that editor with everything. You're going to pre-game with the purpose of why you wrote it. You're going to give them, they should be your friendliest reader in a lot of ways because they're giving you the benefit of the doubt. They're going to read that book. They're going to look into it. And they're also going to be really looking at it to try and help you make it better. And so that's always going to be contentious. Nobody likes to come in here like, this part's kind of shitty. That sucks. It sucks to hear. Nobody likes it. Nobody wants to hear it. But if you don't hear it now, you're going to hear it later on your Amazon reviews, or I would offer you're going to read it yourself years later, and you're going to think that's not really working too well. Like, because even you yourself become a reader when you get enough separation from what you originally write. You write it, and then years later, when you pick it up again, you read it, and you can almost sometimes not believe that these are the words you put on paper. Like, what the hell was I thinking? Why did I do this? Why did I do that? And so the editor is helping you fix that. And so embrace that. Embrace that. It is uncomfortable. Do you have to take every piece of feedback? No. Are you going to put some things in there that you just like, I'm just going to keep it because I just want to? Okay. But the feedback is super useful. And the feedback is what is going to help make you and your story better. And so, yeah, completely agree.
So I think some people see the editor as the villain of their story.
Like a gatekeeper. Like
the thing is, I want your book to be great. I want to read a great book and say, this was the best book I ever read. Don't change a thing. That's what I want to. That's not what you paid me. You paid me to do that if it's true. But what you paid me to do is give you the honest feedback and how, in my opinion, with my experience and skills, I think you can make it the best book it can be. And it's not a fight. I'm not going to fight with you. I'm just going to tell you what I think based on my experience. And so sometimes it's and some people are, they're just like, tell me how to fix it. All right, I changed everything you said. I'm going to publish it. But that's the problem is I tell you how to fix everything in your book, but if you fix everything the way I say it, it's not necessarily going to make it the best book it could be because some of them are dependent on different things. Like, hey, if you want to go this way with this book, change this. If you want to go this way with this book, change this other thing. And if you change both of those, now it's maybe worse than it was because those things don't connect. And so, I mean, I've edited some books 8 times because after they made the changes that they wanted to make, they gave it back. And almost every single time that I've read the second version, it's been like so much better. But there's still a couple problems that I can list. Now, I thought that she was going to publish it after she gave me the second one. I was like, oh my God, this is so great. Now here's a couple you pay me some money. So I'm going to tell you some little things you can change. So she went back and changed them and gave it back to me. I was like, why are you giving it back to me? It's like, well, I want to be, I was like, it's never going to be perfect. Every time you pay me money to look at it, I'm going to look as hard as I can to find something that'll make it a little bit better. But that doesn't mean this isn't ready to go to a publisher or an agent. This is definitely ready. And finally, I stopped charging her. I was just like, all right, I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it again. But seriously, you need to send it to the publisher. And I give her feedback. Finally, it's like, I refuse to read this again send it to a freaking agent.
Well, because you bump into the same problem at a certain point when you've read it enough times, you bump into the same problem that the author himself or herself has, where I'm not really objective enough to be able to give you more feedback. Like in theory, the two of us working on a project will eventually hit a point of diminishing returns when I've gotten all of the useful feedback I can get from you. You have given me your perspective, and we are now at the limits of what our two perspectives can put into this thing. And so unless you're going to bring in a third editor, which to me, at a certain point, good enough's good enough. And I haven't done it, so maybe I'm wrong here, but I feel that if you bring it to another editing team, what you risk is kind of derailing it. Like if anybody's done any project work and just project management on any kind of big project, you've got to at some point scope who's providing inputs, or you'll end up chasing the X forever and you will never hit it because you'll just keep moving around it in different directions. And so to me, I think you're right. There's somewhere around a couple of edits that's just as good as it gets. It's time to push it to the publisher or the agent, or throw it in the trash if you still hate it. But you're not going to get better by just kind of hammering on it forever. And you actually, well, another thing that's weird about this is we are both discussing this as the point of view of someone, okay, I'm a self-published author. I'm paying an editor to come onto the team to help me make this book better. If you are approaching this with an agent and a traditional publisher, your relationship with your agent and your editor might be completely different, because actually your ability to say, no, I actually want to stick with what I got might not exist if you want to go that route, right? Like you might be like, well, then great, you can't publish it here. You're like, oh, so that's a whole different discussion. But yes, we are assuming that the editor's relationship, while contentious, is essentially one of peers and not one of, I'm trying to make sure that you are willing to, you just want to prove this. And if you don't prove it, you're more like my boss in that case, which I actually don't know how to navigate that relationship as an author. I mean, I've done it professionally, but I would imagine that feels very different.
I mean, an editor, as an editor, I have a bunch of testimonials on my webpage of people I've worked with, and I want them to publish their book, the best book they can, because I want other people to read the book, say, hey, who was your editor? And then to say it was me, so that I can edit another book. So there's there's nothing in me. There's no bad bone in my body that wants me to make you have a bad book.
That's right. We all want to succeed. Everybody wants the project to go well. There's nobody on here that's like the red shirt or the evil infiltrator that's trying to sabotage it. Unless you really hate your editor, you have a bad relationship, hey, probably should pick somebody different. If you feel that's at risk, go a different direction.
Well, I think we're up for the hour. I guess if there's anyone out there and you guys got some questions or some topics for us, you can send us an email off my webpage, thestoryninjas.com, or you can put it in the comments right now, and we'll see it and we'll take note of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a good conversation, man. I think we cover a lot of ground on kind of how you shape a plot and kind of how you build, kind of how you just, one, what raw ingredients do you need to build a good book? And then how do you hammer those raw ingredients into something successfusly? Like what process do you use to kind of do that? And I think we could probably spend more time on that process. I mean, we talked a lot of ingredients today. We talked a lot of like the general flow of how it goes. Maybe next time we spend a little time talking through the actual process of like, all right, let's talk about laying out the stuff and then refine. How do you kind of do that? I think this would have been very useful to me as a new writer who was just picking up a pen and trying to get things on paper. And I hope it's helpful to other people too.
Yeah, me too. All right. Well, hey, good to see you again, Dan. And thanks for joining us, everyone out there.
Yep. Take care.
Yeah, we can